Purple Robe here, and you have reached Chapter 2 of Midnight Surrogate. Chapter 2 gets even more hardcore, but it's good. I mean, leave some comments. Leave comments. I'm really interested to know how y'all feel about this particular story. It's very different than my other ones if you've listened to them. And I love to get the feedback. I'm always writing. I'm writing new things now, and your comments help me, choose what I want to write, how I want to write it. So check out Chapter 2, and I'll see you on the other side.
Eventually, Joanne's tears, as well as her shouts, tapered off. She pulled the covers off the bed, wrapped herself up, and fell asleep. This time when she awoke, she was immediately aware of a stiffness in her neck from the awkward position of her body. She stood, leaving the blankets on the ground. She was still here in this foreign room. Somehow she thought in a Wizard of Oz kind of way that she'd wake up in her own bed, the victim of an awful dream. It was not to be. The clock told her that she'd slept for nearly 4 hours. It was close to 11, and Joanne realized she was very hungry. She crept toward the fridge and opened it, afraid that it might hold severed heads or something equally gruesome. A large tank filled with clear water dominated the top shelf. It had a nozzle that, when depressed, allowed its contents to flow. Jo peeked around the room and found no cups. Great, she thought. When she wanted to drink, she was going to have to lay on the ground and stick her head under the faucet. The inside door was stacked with plastic bottles of soda. Jo grabbed a Coca-Cola, twisted off the cap, and took a swig. The cold felt good against the back of her raw throat. On the bottom shelf was a few pieces of fruit, some small Tupperware containers, and what looked like a sub-sandwich wrapped in deli paper. Below this was a crisper that she found filled with a head of romaine lettuce and some assorted vegetables. She grabbed the wrapped parcel, shut the door, and climbed back on the bed. It was definitely a sub, turkey and Swiss, lovingly, handmade, and apparently fresh. She liked turkey and Swiss. People knew this fact about her. Was it possible that she had been abducted by someone she knew? Perhaps this was all just a big joke. She glanced down at the chain dangling from her ankle. It's no joke. But still, it might be someone she knew. She took a bite off her meal. It was quite tasty, but then anything might be since she hadn't eaten in almost 24 hours. Between chomps and gulps, she reached out and opened the drawer on the night table stand. Pad of paper, box of crayons, and 3 remote controls. One was for the CD player, she found. One was for the DVD player, and the last one was for the TV. She recognized them by their different brands. She grabbed the last and tapped the on button. The television snapped on, showed an initializing message, and then went blank. Guess they don't get cable out here. She tried changing the channels briefly, saw no difference, and flipped it off. Her gaze shifted to the bookcase while she chewed. There was a neat row of paperbacks, and she read a few of the titles. American Gods, Feet of Clay, If on a Winter's Night a Traveler, The Princess Bride? She'd never heard of any of them, nor their authors. Then she noticed a Stephen King book. It was entitled The Stand. That one may be familiar. Though she'd heard of King, she'd never read any of his work and didn't care much for horror stories. She couldn't make out the titles of the DVDs on the shelf below and was thinking about getting out of bed to look when her eyes happened on one of the 3 doors. One of the 3 locked doors. It was the one to her right, beside the fridge, and it was slightly ajar. She practically leapt up, almost tangling herself in the restrictive cord, and threw the door wide. It was one of those that slid into the wall. What she found was a well-stocked pantry. A maroon garbage can with a swing-top lid stood on the floor below 6 shelves. There were paper and plastic goods, as well as dried foodstuffs. She found extra rolls of toilet paper as well as napkins. There were matching sheaths of plastic cups, red and blue. Single-serving bags of chips filled one section, as well as more sodas. She wished she'd have noticed this before she'd eaten. The chips would have gone well with the sandwich, she thought wistfully. She noticed that the shelves were made of flimsy wire mesh and were bolted into the walls just as soundly as the rest of the furniture. It would be easier to tear a section off than to pull them out of the wall. The pantry closet was quite shallow, so that, with the shelves in place, there was no way whatsoever she could be able to fit inside. And what would she do even if she could? All her captor had to do was walk into the room and see her chain leading from the bed under the pantry door to know precisely where she was hiding. Jo reached between half-filled Ziploc bags marked salt, sugar, and pepper. and knocked on the back wall of the tiny pantry niche. It was rough and scraped her knuckles. It was also quite solid. Joe had no frame of reference, but guessed the back wall was either concrete or cinder blocks. Either way, there would be no tunneling out in this direction. She pushed those thoughts aside for one that might be more important. She was sure that this door had been locked up tight when she checked a few hours ago. Had someone been in the room while she was sleeping? Without a second thought, Joe dove over the bed to the door on the other side and grabbed the knob, rattling it, but to no avail. It was still locked, and so was the other one. Someone was playing with her, she thought. Her suspicions were confirmed when she glanced again at the door with the rectangular window in it. It was indented, sort of like an arrow loop in a castle turret, but it was horizontal instead of vertical. It was no longer darkened, as if covered on the other side. To stand up against the door, Joanne needed to be at the extent of her chain, which had wound itself up somehow. She untangled it and pressed herself against the door, pushing her face into the indentation as much as she could, so she could bring her eyes as close to the glass as possible. It was useless. Either it was tinted too dark, or there was no light in the room beyond. Maybe there was just nothing out there. Either way, she couldn't make out anything at all. Still, this must be the way out. She backed off. Was someone watching her at this moment? She judged the angle of the slot. From the way it was indented, she equated that there were many spots in the room that couldn't be seen. Joe sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the peephole. For some reason, she was very aware of her bare feet. It was cold inside the room, so she warmed her toes under the blankets that lay on the floor. She hadn't located any sort of thermostat. Perhaps she'd check the pantry wall again. The same thoughts were swirling around her mind. Am I supposed to be doing something? What's going to happen? What do they want from me? After a bit, she began to vocalize these thoughts, speaking to the white door, to the eyes she was certain were behind the window in it. No one answered. Joe gave up. She quieted down and again began peering about her prison cell. Was she supposed to be looking for something? Was this some kind of perverse game? Were there clues here to help her escape? If so, she didn't feel like playing. Maybe she would later. Maybe she wouldn't be able to help herself. But now that the panic had dissipated, her hunger had been stifled, her bodily functions were taken care of, she was overcome by a tremendous melancholy. Joanne had always been a woman of action. When a situation presented her with a problem, whether it was at work or in her personal life, she had always met it head-on. She created a plan that she would see through to the end. Wouldn't necessarily solve things, but that just meant a new strategy was to be formulated and more actions were to be taken. What was her strategy now? What was she supposed to do? She'd never experienced such impotence. She guessed this sadness must be what it's like to have erectile dysfunction, and that produced a slight smile. Who had erectile dysfunction anymore, now that Viagra was available? Joanne just needed some mental Viagra. Then she could escape. Only she had none. She had nothing but this newfound melancholy. And then there was a knock on the door. It was the door with the peephole, and Joe wasn't sure what to do. Did whoever was out there want her to invite him in? That's just fucking stupid. She stood up, gathered the blankets off the floor, and pulled them up in front of her. Her white knuckles pressed up under her chin, and the comforter cascaded all around her. The door opened, and the person she guessed to be her captor entered. It was definitely a man, though practically all his features were covered. He was maybe 5'8" or 9, thought Joe, just a couple inches taller than her. He wore a gray, long-sleeved cotton shirt and black sweatpants with what appeared to be a new pair of Adidas tennis shoes. He was of average weight, not fat in any way, but not skinny at all. His clothes were a little baggy, so it was hard to tell what sort of shape he was in. And he was wearing some kind of rubber Halloween mask. It wasn't of the scary variety. At least there were no fangs or fur or horns or blood on it. It looked familiar to Joanne, but she couldn't point where it had been that she'd seen this face before. It had a swoop of painted-on black hair that dove between two high-arching eyebrows and large, expressive brown eyes that were almost feminine, with 3 over-exaggerated lashes on each of the outside corners. There was a cute little button nose and tiny, overly red Cupid bow lips that made the mask even more girly. The overall impression of it was a little off-putting. Completing the ensemble was a small leather shoulder bag whose strap ran across his chest. The satchel part rested comfortably against his backside. The man closed the door behind him and stopped before her. He didn't make a sound. What the hell was he waiting for? Jo wondered frantically. Panic swelled up in her, and she could wait no more. Who the hell are you? Where am I? And how did I get here? That was the beginning, but there were so many more questions. Her voice was calm, but firm. Still, he had said nothing, and this made her angry. What the fuck was going on? Are you going to answer me? I swear to God, I'm going to kick the shit out of you if you don't let me go right now, she bluffed. Joanne hadn't been in a fight since 8th grade when Cindy Pickens splashed milk on her blouse in the school cafeteria on a dare, and Jo had slapped her hard across the face in response. The two girls had rolled on the ground, struggling against each other for about 90 seconds before teachers had intervened. She'd ended up with a scratch on her arm. Somehow she'd torn a hole in Cindy's pants. Well, fucking say something, asshole! The fact that he just stood there was pissing her off to no end. And since he wasn't threatening her, she felt bolder as the seconds wore on. Maybe she had never been in a real fight in her life, but as adrenaline began pumping through her system, she guessed that perhaps she could wrestle this masked dickhead to the ground and maybe even strangle him to death. He must have the keys to her cuffs on him, in a pocket or something. Her whole body hummed with the expectation of action. Finally, he moved. He raised his left hand, finger pointed skyward, and placed it in front of his lips. Shh. That fuck was all Jo could process. Her anger became rage. This son of a bitch had kidnapped her, chained her up, scared her half to death, and let's not forget her stolen clothes. Now he was shushing her like an over-talkative child? Jo took a menacing step toward him, balling her hands into fists. Her breath was coming in rasps. In her mind, she envisioned a perfect linebacker's tackle to the midsection, her body diving completely horizontal in the air and folding him in half with the impact. When the man took a step back in reaction, she was certain this is exactly how it would play out. Then she halted. He had pulled a gun from his satchel with his right hand. The mad energy completely drained from her body. Her eyes grew wide as saucers as she stared at the weapon, which was... Wait a minute. It was not a gun. It was shaped like a gun. That was sure enough. But there was something strange about it. That's not a gun, she said flatly, unsure of what to do next. It's a taser, the man whispered. I've never used it, but I've read quite a bit about them. It's said that the vast majority of subjects, after being tasered once, will comply so as to avoid being tased a second time. He let the words sink in, and they sunk. Joanne felt thoroughly defeated before any battle had even begun. She felt the chill of the room more acutely and started to shiver. Please believe me when I say that I don't really want to use this, he continued. So if you'll just do as I ask without any hassles, we can be finished quickly and without discomfort. She wondered why he was whispering. Was there something the matter with his voice? And what could he possibly want her to do? She got the impression that he had memorized the last few lines he had spoken, as if he wanted to say them just so. How long had he been practicing for this encounter? Please lay down on the edge of the foot of the bed, with your back to me, facing the wall. She couldn't even comprehend these simple instructions. Her mind was sluggish and muddy, as if she'd been suddenly drugged. Please, he repeated, and waved the weapon in the direction of where he wanted her. Having the business end of the taser pointed at her, even as it passed by, toward the bed, jolted her into action. She turned around, still holding the blankets, and sat down on the edge of the bed, twisting her torso so that she was still facing the wall. It was a very fresh shade of white and unadorned, like all the rest of the walls in the room. Please lay down, he instructed. This overwhelming courtesy was unnerving, as was his soft whisper of a voice. Jo felt robotic as she flopped onto her side. Her right leg was now trapped under her, while her chained left dangled almost to the floor. She pulled the covers even closer and stared numbly at the pattern woven into them. It was large squares in the middle and tiny diamonds on the ends. She could no longer see her assailant, but she could hear his shoes whispering on the carpet as he moved toward her. Joanne had a way of detaching herself from certain situations, like when she was at the dentist's office and the hygienist was cleaning her teeth with that whirling mechanical thingy. She could lay there and zone out, letting her thoughts drift peacefully while the work was being done. The girls that cleaned her teeth always said she was their favorite patient because she was so relaxed in the chair. She dove headfirst into this ability as she lay on the bed. It wasn't as if she turned her mind off. She wandered down all sorts of cerebral alleys. But don't ask her what she was thinking about when it was over, because she'd never be able to remember. "I'm going to put my hand on your leg and lift it onto the bed, so don't be surprised when you feel me touch you." And he did exactly what he said, politely, almost as a doctor would maneuver a patient. Next, he switched the taser to his left hand, and then placed that hand gently but firmly on her shoulder. Jo simply lay there uncomprehending and uncaring. She just hoped that whatever he was going to do would be done quickly, and then he would let her go. She heard him doing something or other behind her, without really listening. What might have been the pop-top of a shampoo bottle opening. He mentioned that he was going to touch her leg again, and was once more true to his word. His hand on her was warm and gentle, almost caressing. It was high on her thigh, and the chill of the room made her tingle in a not altogether unpleasant way. When he finished, he switched the taser back to his right, and laid that hand back on her shoulder. "Now this might feel a little wet, but try to relax," he said after an apparent moment of inaction. What a strange thing to say, thought Jo. She'd almost forgotten he was back there at all. That is, until he touched her this next time. It didn't feel wet so much as slippery, and it wasn't the sensation that was troubling as much as where he had touched her. Jo tensed up her whole body, gasping in her breath and whitening her knuckles on the blanket. "Oh, God, no, please," were the words that were wrenched from her. The man merely held still while holding her firmly in place with more pressure. The taser dug deep into her shoulder. After a pause, he continued his work by wiggling his fingers and then his knuckles, which were covered with water-based lubrication, deep inside Joanne's vagina. "Please don't do this. Please," she pleaded, thick, hot tears forming in the corners of her eyes and rolling to the bed. "It'll be over quickly, I promise," he soothed. His whispered voice easy to hear, since he was now laying much of his weight on her shoulder, and his lips were quite close to her ear, with as little discomfort as possible. He removed his hand. She felt him rub up against her, and began wiggling away. He replaced his hand with his elbow, keeping the full amount of his bulk on top of her, and pressed the muzzle of his taser up under her chin. "Stop," was all that he said. She did, crying silently but harder. He began kneading her buttocks gently, almost as if he were massaging her. It might have felt good under different circumstances, but this was sheer horror. Why the hell was he doing this? If he was going to rape her, and he wanted to get it over with quickly, like he said, why didn't he just have done with it? A noise she'd heard with many a past boyfriend told her all she needed to know. He had released hold of her and was manually stimulating himself, with the help of the lubrication, it sounded like. When his hand grasped her cheek, this time, it was slick and greasy. He pulled her wide open and penetrated her before she even realized it. A low moan escaped her throat, and she flinched away despite herself. This time, it was the slippery hand on her hip that held her like a vice and pulled her back roughly onto him with strength that she would not have guessed he had. With his hands at her hip and an elbow on her shoulder, he held her fast while he thrust inside of her with quick, rhythmic strokes. Joanne tried her best to become detached again, to let her mind wander to more pleasant thoughts, any thoughts that might take her away from this terrible scene. Try as she might, it was to no avail. Even though she'd easily decided which shade of nail polish she was going to get the next day, or mentally put together a recipe for split pea soup, while previous men had done similar acts to her body when she was not particularly in the mood in the past. The difference was that they had her consent, and this monster did not. At least he was right about one thing. It didn't take him long. It couldn't have been more than 2 or 3 minutes before his breathing became jittery, and he pushed extra hard against her. She was pretty sure when he went rigid and then limp that he had spent himself. My God, she thought aghast. Had he worn a condom? She couldn't tell, but he might have. He'd definitely been fiddling around back there with all sorts of things. That would at least be one tiny consolation. On the heels of this thought came, Christ, that's stupid. What sort of rapist wears a condom? He lay on top of her, and still inside of her, for about as long as it had taken to get him off. This seemed just as bad, if not worse, to Joanne. Finally, he slid himself off. Jo's face was now buried in the thick comforter, her sides convulsing with sobs. She felt a new sensation on her. A warm, wet washcloth was cleaning her shoulder, her thigh, and then between her legs. Her gown was pulled down. The rapist was now speaking to her, asking Joanne if there was anything he could get for her. He was still whispering, and so she couldn't really hear all of what he was saying above her crying. After a while, Jo heard the door open and close a few times. She never turned back to see what was going on. Eventually, she drifted off to sleep yet again.
That was Chapter 2 of Midnight Surrogate. It's getting pretty intense, huh? I hope you liked it. If you did, like, share, and subscribe. And check out episode number 3. By the way, as always, first 5 episodes are on YouTube. Any more than that, and you have to check out my Patreon page in the link.